If you can write a great scene, you can write a great book. They are honestly the building blocks of stories. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 9 ingredients to make the perfect scene, the scene that readers will be talking about at the end of the book, the ones that they're going to tell their friend about when they say, you gotta read this book. The first principle is start late, end early. This is honestly the most important part of all the techniques I'm gonna give you. If you get nothing else from the rest of this video, learn this technique. The vast majority of writers write so-so scenes because they start the scene way too early and there's sort of like this lead up information, and then they dribble on at the end and they don't close it out when they should. I want you to think about a scene you haven't written yet, and then I want you to try to start it as late as you possibly can into that scene. Nope, not that point. Think even further. Like, what's the very closest you can start that scene to the action? This is because you don't want a preamble to your scene, like, oh, let me warm up the reader by like telling them background information. No, you want to dive straight into the action. Now let's think about the end of your scene. A lot of writers will have the high point of the scene, the climax of the scene, and then they'll like talk a little bit more and have a little bit of dialogue and some extra stuff. No, you want to get out early. You want to end that scene early, which means right when that climax happens. Maybe it's a conflict, maybe it's a line of dialogue.
Houston, we have a problem.
Maybe it's an act of violence. Maybe it's a revealed secret.
Answer me, why do people think that I'm you?
Whatever that high point is, stop right there. Stop the scene, put a hashtag in the chapter, and move on to the next scene. When you don't explain, when you don't show the aftermath or the character reaction, the reader is on the edge of their seat. It feels like a cliffhanger, and so they're more likely to want to read the next scene. The second step in genius level scene writing is to use an engine. So every book has a plot engine which propels the reader through the narrative. Sometimes love is an engine. The reader wants to see who's gonna get the girl, who's gonna get the guy, who's gonna fall in love. Sometimes it's a mystery or a murder investigation, or sometimes it's interplanetary. You want to see whether this civilization will be destroyed or saved. Most writers know that their entire novel needs a plot engine, but they don't think about the plot engine of their scenes. Guess what? Every scene needs a plot engine too. Let me give you some examples of plot engines for scenes from the book The Good Lord Bird by James McBride. First, a hidden identity. Here we have a famous abolitionist, John Brown, and he's getting a haircut. That's not a super exciting scene, but what makes the scene interesting is people keep asking him, who are you? Who are you? And he refuses to tell them. That's because the person asking him is a slave trader and he specializes in freeing slaves. But that withholding of information and his hidden identity, it creates this wonderful conflict for the scene. 2, a threat of violence. In another scene in The Good Lord Bird, there are 2 characters talking with each other, and one pulls out a gun and trains it on the other one during the whole conversation. That threat of violence keeps the reader on the edge of their seat. It's not just 2 characters chatting with each other. The presence of the gun lets us know at any moment in this conversation, one of the people could be shot. Here's a third plot engine from a scene. Have a character lie. In another scene, we see John Brown still talking to slave traders, and he's lying through his teeth. I mean, he's making up false names for himself. He's saying, oh, I'm waiting for the steamboat, even though the steamboat isn't supposed to arrive for another 2 weeks. And that lying powers the scene because it makes you wonder, when is he gonna get caught? When is he gonna get exposed? Listen, overall, when you write a scene, you need a nameable strategy for what makes this scene interesting. What is the engine powering your scene? How are you gonna keep readers reading? How are you gonna keep readers enjoying the story? 3, make your scenes multitask. No scene should be accomplishing just a single thing. That's a boring scene. Your scenes need to be furthering the plot and developing that character and furthering that theme. So take a scene that you've written and start a list and write down everything that you think this scene is accomplishing to get us closer toward the end of the book. If that list isn't very long, that's a really good sign that you need to add a lot more to that scene to make sure that it's pulling its weight. Now, the second exercise which you should do, and it's going to be very valuable, so do not skip it, is to pick a scene out of your favorite movie or book. Now write down everything that that scene is accomplishing in terms of setting mood, in terms of theme, in terms of action, in terms of making the reader feel something, in terms of character development, in terms of plot. Really spend some time on it, and I think you're gonna see that that scene is doing so much work. And if you took that scene out of that story, the entire narrative would collapse. And one thing that you can do when you find that you have a lazy scene, a scene that's not doing enough work, is that you can cannibalize other scenes around it, right? You can take from the scene after and try to do what it's doing in this scene and the scene before it and combine it, and suddenly now you just have one really powerful scene instead of 3 scenes each doing one thing. Fourth thing you should do with your scenes is to play with time. Not every scene needs to be moving at the same pace throughout. A good scene often speeds up during the most boring parts, and then it slows down for the most critical parts. Don't write cruise control scenes that just move at the pace of a movie, move at clock time all the way through. This is one of the great advantages you have as a writer rather than as a movie maker, right? Movies generally move at clock time, while in writing, you can speed up, you can slow down, you can play with time, you can skip time a lot more easily. A good exercise to try is to try to summarize a certain portion of a scene. Say you write half of a scene, clock time, characters are speaking to one another, then you need some time to pass, right? So say, oh, they finished up dessert and cleaned the dishes and then they went to the living room to talk more. You've just summarized 15-20 minutes and now you've gotten to the more exciting part so the reader doesn't have to wade through the boring stuff. 5. Supercharge your conflict. Conflict is at the heart of all storytelling. So if you don't have conflict in a scene, that should be this giant red flag waving you, danger, danger. Now, I don't mean the conflict has to be enormous. Sometimes the conflict is very, very small. Sometimes it's very subtle. For instance, say a couple is exchanging dialogue that on its surface isn't barbed or angry, but one of them is seething over household chores that haven't been done, right? So the conflict is in the thoughts, but in the actual dialogue, there's not any conflict, and that's perfectly fine. If you find that your characters are being too nice to one another, that is a problem. And you have to find a way to get conflict in. Perhaps another character is making fun of them at the same time. And the most common problem that I see as an editor when characters are being nice to each other is when they're just sharing information, right? The author knows, oh, I need to further this plot and these characters need to talk about X, Y, and Z to get us to the next scene. Giving information is kind of boring though. So you have to find a way to get that information across with conflict embedded in it. Maybe one character doesn't believe the other. Maybe one character disagrees with the other about that information. Now let's play devil's advocate for just a second. And let's say you say, I don't think that conflict is necessary for every scene. I mean, there are exceptions to the rule. You might be able to find a very rare scene in a movie or a book that doesn't have conflict. But most of the time, if you sort of peer under the hood and really analyze what's going on, there's some level of disagreement embedded between the two characters. And if you have a scene without conflict in your novel, you need to, 1, come up with a reason why that scene is really necessary for the book, and 2, find a justification for why that scene won't bore the reader to death. 6, make your character change. Most of the time that we talk about character arcs, it's over the course of the entire novel, right? And you want to see the character change by the very end. I would encourage you to think about character arcs on a micro level. How does a character subtly change within a single scene? By the time that the scene ends, you should be able to analyze your character at the beginning of that scene, at the end of the scene, and detect some sort of small learning or changing or growth. For instance, they might make a decision that shows them maturing as a character or backsliding, right? That's also change. Even if a character is refusing to change, that fits inside the change umbrella because the reader is wanting them to change and yet they're refusing to change. And so it creates this wonderful tension and conflict in the story. And this is a great way to see whether the glue of your scene is holding together. Ask yourself, in what way does my character change or grow or learn in this particular scene? 7, make sure it's essential to plot progression. So if you look at the structure of a novel, it's a bunch of scenes lined up with each other until you reach the end and you feel satisfied for some reason. And if a reader doesn't feel that the scenes are linking to one another and building toward an endpoint, they're gonna stop reading. I once wrote an incredible first chapter of a novel that featured these geeky, hilarious, energetic American soccer players hitting on European girls in a club. It was amazing. I wanted to structure the whole book around it. There was only one problem though. It didn't really link up to the next chapter. It didn't build the overall plot line. And when I sent to agents, that was pretty much their feedback. I'd promised one thing in the query letter, but this particular chapter didn't progress the plot. So even though that was one of my favorite scenes I've ever written, I had to delete it because it didn't fit into the book as a whole. Think of your scenes as a series of boxcars, right? Each linked up to one another. And if a boxcar doesn't pull the one before it and push the one in front of it, then you're not creating a chain that's going to be strong and linked, and the reader's not going to get through all of it. 8, prioritize actions and dialogue over thoughts and backstory. You know what a great exercise is to pick a scene that you've written and then divide it up into categories. Divide it up into action, description, dialogue, thoughts, and backstory. And then figure out the approximate ratio of each one. Is most of it dialogue? Is most of it thoughts? Is most of it backstory? A bad scene often contains far too high of a ratio of backstory and thoughts and not enough of the present moment action of what's actually happening in the scene. Now, I'm not saying you don't need thoughts and backstory. Both are great devices, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying pay attention to the ratios of what you're doing in a particular scene. If the ratios are off, that should flip a little, danger signal in your brain. You should think, all right, maybe I need to rejigger this scene a little bit to make sure things are actually happening right now. The ninth and final point is 3 essential questions for every scene. 1, what would happen if I cut this scene? It's always a great question to ask yourself, because if you can cut it and the book doesn't suffer, you don't really need it in the book. Every scene should be absolutely core for helping the reader reach the end of the book. 2, ask yourself, what has changed by the end of my scene? Are we a little bit closer to finding out the mystery? Are we a little bit closer to 2 characters falling in love? Or a little bit further away from 2 characters falling in love? And 3, how does this scene move the story forward? What does it accomplish in terms of character development, in terms of plot? If you can answer all 3 of those questions satisfactorily, then you have written a scene that has earned a right to stay in your book.